Hi everyone, welcome to another Lincoln Network webinar. This one is all about canvassing technology, how to improve what you're doing out in the field. I'm Corey from Lincoln. Sorry, I had my own volume on there for a second. I'm Corey from Lincoln. Joining us, we have Kendall Tucker, who is from Polis. I'll let her introduce herself a bit and then start presenting to you all. So thanks for joining.
Great. Can everyone see my screen? All right, I'm going to assume that you can. So I'm going to get started. Hey, everyone. My name is Kendall Hope Tucker, and I'm the founder and CEO of Polis. So I'll get to what Polis is on the next screen. But before I started at Polis, I was very involved in politics. So I spent about 9 years managing political initiatives, doing community organizing, getting people really, really excited about knocking on their neighbors' doors and getting them involved and getting them voting. It's a particularly auspicious day to be having this webinar about door-to-door canvassing, because obviously in many places today is election day. So thank you all so much for joining us today. I hope you're taking a break. I know many people are working very, very hard to get their candidates elected today. And if you haven't already, please remember to go out and vote. None of the work we do matters unless people care and go out and turn out to the polls. So what is Polis? My team and I started Polis about 2 years ago. And what we wanted to do is we wanted to build software that helped campaigns to consistently win elections. And what we came up with was door knocking software that made it super easy for passionate people to get involved in their own communities and immediately start having an impact on local campaigns. So our first year of operation was 2016. We had about 150 campaigns knock about 3 million doors. So it was this incredible trove of people who cared about elections and people who knocked doors and got data coming back into our system so we could learn more about door-to-door best practices and what actually works when you're running a great political campaign. Since 2016, we've actually expanded into the door-to-door sales space. So we're now working with about 20 corporations, mostly in the energy sector, that are knocking doors and talking to neighbors about different energy choice in their markets. And I personally think that we're doing a lot to revolutionize door-to-door outreach. My team is both here where I am in Cambridge, Massachusetts, right by Harvard, and also in Salt Lake City, Utah. So if you're ever in either city, feel free to reach out. We love meeting new people. And before I get into really the bulk of this presentation, I just want to mention that we're expecting a good number of people on this call, but please feel free to instant message your questions. I'm happy to stop, explain anything more in depth, and obviously I'm going to take a lot of questions. I would love to have a conversation at the end. So I can't see the instant message bar right now, but I'm sure Corey will let me know if you message and we can stop and have that conversation. So why do I care so much about door knocking? So I've run a lot of campaigns in my day, and what we've actually found through the political science research is the efficacy of calling people on their phones right now, in particular because there's the do not call list for cell phones. Most people don't have home phones anymore. It's statistically insignificant to call people on phones. So it doesn't really change whether or not they're going to vote in the upcoming election. It is effective to run television ads. I'm sure you've all done it at some point in time. It is wildly expensive and doesn't move the needle a lot, but you can certainly get people to turn out to vote through TV. Social media is actually a very effective way to run campaigns. You can get about 5% of people to either change their viewpoints or to turn out to vote if their friends are contacting them online. We'll talk a little bit at the end of how do you use door knocking data to turn people out on social media. But really, the most effective and therefore impressive part of running a campaign is doing door knocking. When you knock on someone's door and you have a 5 to 10 minute conversation with them, that person becomes 20% more likely to vote in the upcoming election. This just makes a huge impact on people when you stand in front of them and you take the time to look them in the eye and listen to what they care about. But obviously, I run a door knocking company. I love door-to-door canvassing. Not every campaign should go door-to-door. And I want to be honest about that so that everyone is using their time well. So there's a few factors to consider when you're deciding whether to go door-to-door. We'll go through this pretty quickly because I'm sure a lot of people on this call just want to discuss the best ways to go door-to-door and how to use the new forms of data out there to succeed. But the first thing you have to consider when you're thinking about a canvassing campaign or a field campaign is your location. So obviously, if you're in Minnesota right now, the weather really isn't super conducive to canvassing. I've known some great candidates up there. They've put on huge amounts of clothing. They've gone door to door and had tremendous success because people love seeing that you're doing the work to knock doors in the winter. But you really need to figure out if your campaign and your volunteers are willing to go through the snowstorm to support your candidate. The other thing is you should be able to knock at least 20 doors an hour to make it worthwhile. And if you're not in suburbs or neighborhoods, it's very difficult to hit those numbers. So if you're in very rural areas or you're in Manhattan, it may not be the right campaign to focus a lot of your time and money on door-to-door canvassing. The next thing you have to think about is whether you can make an impact on your win number from door-to-door canvassing. So I'm sure many of you have run phenomenal campaigns in the past. What I do in the first 48 hours of taking over a campaign is figuring out a win number. And what that means is I sit down and I think about how many people voted in this election, in the previous election, how many votes we need to win, what the district looks like in terms of Republican versus Democrat, whether or not my candidate is an incumbent. And you have to figure out if your win number is a certain number, how can you have enough contacts to get you there? And we'll talk more near the end of how many times you need to contact someone to actually make an impact. But if you're running in Texas for governor, it'll be difficult to make an impact in your win number just from door-to-door canvassing. It can certainly be a very important part of your messaging, but you're going to need to do a bit more than if you're running for city council, where this really can be the bulk of your time and energy on political campaigns. C, campaign size. Do you have enough people to canvass? We're going to talk a bit about volunteer canvassing versus paid canvassing on this webinar. But you really have to understand that if each person knocks 20 to 30 doors an hour, how do you get that main number up to your win number? And do you have enough people to do that? And lastly, how many days do you have to make an impact? We generally advise campaigns on a 6 to 12 month time schedule of doing persuasion campaigning and then ultimately get out the vote campaigning. If you only have a few weeks left, you really got to decide where you're going to make that impact. And obviously, if you're running an election today, I'm not sure that starting a door knocking campaign right now would make an impact. But if all of these factors, you say, yes, my campaign is perfect for door to door, we'd love to continue having that conversation. So, how do you run a canvassing operation that will guarantee that you'll win your campaign? So there are 4 different aspects of a great canvassing operation. The first one that we think about is prospecting voters with high quality data. Something that's still fairly new in the political campaign space. And so what we actually see is a lot of groups that come to us say, look, any voter might support my organization or my candidate. I can just register people to vote if they're not voters or they haven't voted before. But unfortunately, canvassers that knock every door waste on average about 30 minutes per hour, so about half their time, at houses that are either unlikely to vote in general or unlikely to support their candidate. And unfortunately, even if your organization is amazing and your candidate is great, very often if you knock every door, you're actually turning out voters who will directly oppose your candidate in the upcoming election. So the data is really, really important. Different ways that we think about data here at Polis. The first is who should you talk to? And so in general, you want this to be a fairly wide swath of people. You obviously want to talk to people who are consistent voters. You want to talk to people who probably have a shared ideology with you. And you can decide what that means. Most people start with political party, something like that. But then you need to determine what to say. And this is the next frontier of political data. And so when you go to doors, you certainly should never change, because ultimately we're living in the age of Twitter that will get back to all of your supporters. But what you can do is you can knock on doors with relevant messaging for those people. And what I mean is, I run campaigns in Massachusetts. We have towns that have very high Spanish populations. And so we've run campaigns where at Spanish doors, we actually have Spanish surveys. So we can give them in Spanish if the canvasser is a Spanish speaker, and we can talk to issues that actually matter to those towns. Similarly, we can give different surveys to Republicans versus independents because we're trying to understand what they care about and what actually motivates them to support a campaign. The data sources are really phenomenal and very, very interesting. And just to give you an example, this is how we here at Polis think about data. This is a very granular look at some data in downtown Boston. So what you're seeing, totally just as an example, is we've picked out higher income people who have a credit card and live in downtown Boston. Dig into that, see who lives in these apartments, and then we could consider messaging them differently. For example, everyone's talking about taxes right now. And so how you would message someone who makes more than $100,000 a year on the president's tax plan would be different than how you would message someone who makes less than $100,000 a year. Different concerns, they're going to be asking different questions. And so for you to have the most effective door-to-door outreach on this issue, you really want to understand who's behind the door before you knock on it. So if you have any questions on that, I'm happy to take them later. But the next question that I would ask is, where do you get this data and what does it look like? You can certainly get free data from your city or state government. What we find is it's not updated often enough to be helpful. About 10% of Americans move each year, so there's some serious problems with data cleanliness, and you certainly don't want canvassers who are knocking on doors and constantly getting the wrong names. But beyond that, the GOP Data Center has a file that you can get at least once you're through the primary. They generally give to state parties for free. A high quality file. It plugs into Polis or any other software that you would want to use. Alternatively, you can use the Data Trust. They work more with political action committees and organizations. L2 is an independent nonpartisan group that has some really great data we've done work with. And then, of course, you can use Polis. So you have really high quality data. You know what your organization stands for and who you want to talk to. The next step in your door-to-door canvassing is figuring out how you're going to train your canvassers and then what they're going to do. So this may seem really obvious, but unfortunately, 65% of organizations send their canvassers out without any planning. So this is your opportunity to win your election. You're going to be so much better planned. Your door knockers are going to be so much happier, that this is really where you need to focus. So first and foremost, some of you may have done this before, some of you may not. We run door knocking trainings all the time. What we usually do is we print out scripts. They'll have 2 or 3 surveys on there, depending on which different people you're talking to. We'll hand them out, let everyone read them over, and then we'll actually take them away. Now what we do is we have them role play in groups of 2 or 3. And so they'll knock on a door, a fake door, and someone will answer, and first they'll play the nice neighbor. And then they'll play the mean neighbor, and then they'll play the very questioning neighbor. And this gets people really used to going through the motions of having a great conversation and being a genuine person. We found this to be really effective. We then do it in front of the whole group. And you only need to do this once before people go out and knock doors, and they start feeling really confident in their own right, and then they can collect the data and become more creative. The next thing you need to do during a training is make sure everyone truly understands your software and data collection method. There's a lot of different software you can use, but all of the software out there at this point, we're tracking people's GPS locations. We're tracking their success rates, we're tracking them for fraud. So it's really important that you're sending people out on an app, so you're getting that data in live, and you can make sure that everything is going according to plan. Lastly, you need to explain the incentive structure to your door knockers. So we're seeing incentive structures all over the map right now. They're all wonderful. But if you're all volunteers, then you should be giving your top volunteers prizes. And a prize could be something as simple as getting coffee with the candidate. If it's a paid Canvas program, then obviously you pay based on number of doors knocked or number of supporters. And within that, you can still give prizes and have leaderboards and get people really, really excited about working for your organization. I'm going to kind of skip over this slide, but in terms of your scripts, keep them simple. Your door knockers are really trying to infuse their own personality, their own viewpoints on your organization. Just make sure they're getting the same data in some sort of consistent fashion so that you can follow up with the voters after you have that first conversation. Nothing is more important than being able to have a targeted follow-up where you say, hey, John Smith, you told us you care about the environment. This is what our candidate thinks. So we've spoken about leaderboards and the importance of tracking and planning. This is just an example of a Polis leaderboard. As you can see, we have our door knockers, number of doors knocked, number of conversations, and we're just tracking their success rate. So we know exactly what each person is doing, how many supporters they're getting, and it's a really easy way to just be on top of everything that's going on. And lastly, for this section of planning, you really need to choose the software that works for you. So I am in no way here telling you to choose Polis. It has worked great for the organizations that we've worked with, but we also recognize that it's not perfect for everyone. We do things in a very systematic way. And so the two big things you need to think about when you're choosing door knocking software is how you want to manage your canvassers. So on this screen right now, where it says plan territories, you can see two different ways to manage canvassers. On the left is the more traditional way. Many people call this turf cutting. And what you see is there's different households in a region, and a manager has gotten into the office very early in the morning and drawn a polygon on that map. So this manager is going to send the polygon to a canvasser. Generally, they come into the office, they discuss it first, and the canvasser gets this polygon on his or her phone and goes out and knocks doors. So it's extremely structured. You know exactly what each person's doing. It's a bit more time consuming, but lots of organizations love it. On the right is how Polis manages our territories. So what you're seeing is one of our canvassers has been assigned the city of Randolph, Massachusetts. I don't know if anyone knows Randolph who's listening to this. But this person has access to all of the data in Randolph of the voters that we want to contact. And then he or she can zoom in and then reserve a territory for 12 hours. And what that means is that person now has 50 voters that he or she is going to knock. He has very specific instructions at each door of what to say and what data to collect. But it's a little bit more freewheeling in that he or she can wake up every day, generate a new route, and then the manager actually monitors it on the back end to say, great, I see that she was where she said she was. The responses look great. The GPS locations are all correct. And great, I trust what he or she is doing. And then we've touched on this a bunch, but you really want to have surveys that are relevant to the door that you're knocking on. So what you're seeing in this screen is this called Boolean Logic. So you're saying when the state is equal to New York, then give people the New York survey. Or we see it done much more often when political party is equal to Republican, then give them a Republican survey. And so this gives you a lot of flexibility to test messaging. You can obviously A/B test stuff. It gives you the flexibility to make sure that you're actually having an impact at every door. And it's a great way to just be on top of your canvassing operation in the same way that you would run a Google AdWords campaign. You're spending money, you're spending people's time. You have to make sure that every interaction is extremely worthwhile. And then this is part of that level of worthwhile. You need to understand your impact. So at the very beginning, you need to know what your goals are from canvassing. And so if your goal is get out the vote, then you should be only targeting supporters. You need to know who's going to support you or who's most likely to support you. And then you're knocking on those doors and you're saying, hey, there's an election in 2 weeks. We need you to turn out right now. Persuasion is when you focus on independents or swing voters. And you say, hey, my organization is running a campaign in the next 6 months. We think it's really important for X, Y, and Z reason. Would you consider supporting us? And then you have to focus on these people and follow up multiple times. If you're running a media campaign, this is where you're trying to get more focus on your campaign. You're trying to show decision makers in your town or your state that you're committed to this campaign. You're out there knocking doors. And so generally in media door knocking, you are focusing on presidents of PTOs. You're focusing on reporters, you're focusing on other electeds. And obviously you're gonna knock on doors around those people as well, but this is a bit more of a targeted door knocking outreach because sometimes when you're running for Senate, you can't knock every door in the district. And then lastly, my favorite type of door knocking is the door knocking where you're going above and beyond. So you've already been elected to a position and you wanna make sure that your constituents are getting the services that they deserve. So this is when your political arm goes out, knocks doors, and talks to people about the resources that they can use because they voted for you to a certain position. So once you know exactly what your impact is, you've trained your canvassers, you've sent them out into the field, the most important thing you need to do is you need to monitor the results live as these people are out knocking. So Polis, for example, has dashboards. They all update while everyone's out in the field. I think a lot of there's different ways to do this. But some results that we've come to expect, and we get concerned if it's not this when our partners are out door knocking, is that almost everyone is going to say that they support your candidate. Expect this. Don't take it very seriously. It does not mean you're automatically going to win your election. But if you're getting results back in that are not very positive about your candidate, you should probably think about your surveys, probably talk to your canvassers, figure out something that you can change to start getting better responses back in. More than 90% of people will say that they're voting in the upcoming election. You still need to remind them during Get Out the Vote to go vote. Tons of people forget if it's not a presidential election. And lastly, less than 5% of people should refuse your canvassers. So we have essentially a Polis do not knock list. We really try hard not to bother people at the doors who don't like having their door knocked on. But 99% of the time, people are very, very nice when they see someone else at their door. It's a lot harder to be rude to someone than it is over the phone. So just be aware of that. If you're getting a lot of refusals, I think it's time to loop back with your canvassers and make sure they're not doing something that's upsetting people. And then while your door knockers are out in the field, be available for questions. We call it leapfrogging door knockers, but consider taking out your car, monitoring them on your app, whatever you're using, and going out and just seeing how they're doing, seeing if you can be helpful. You can also contact them through an app, or obviously you can call them. Don't let door knockers feel alone while they're out knocking, because then they're not going to want to knock anymore. And it's substantially harder to recruit new door knockers than to keep your trained good knockers happy. And then lastly, something fun that we have tried at Polis, and we're happy to spread the things that work very well, is we've actually sent out huge door knocking parties. So let's say 50 volunteers at a time. And we've held the candidate back in the office. And then as the results come in live to our campaign's headquarters, the candidate calls about 5 to 10 minutes behind, says, hey, I heard you just spoke to my door knocker, Katie. She said that you really care about the environment. Can I answer any questions for you? And we find when the candidate follows up in that way, they're getting something like an 80% response rate for people answering their phones. And then the support numbers are off the walls. People love it. And then the last part about monitoring your door knockers, this is unfortunate. I don't love talking about it, but you really do need to monitor people for fraud. Whether they're getting paid by every door they knock on or they're just doing it as volunteers. Unfortunately, we're seeing about 10% of door knocks in the political space coming back fraudulent. But it's very easy to monitor for fraud. We track GPS locations, we track the pace of door knocks, and then we also look for anomalies in door knocking results. So people who are having very different success rates than other people in their organizations. Using Polis, you can just shut off someone's account immediately. If you think they're fraudulent, reach out to them. And there's a lot of other ways where you can monitor for fraud as long as you're using software at the doors and not paper and clipboard. The last thing that you want to do to run a really phenomenal door knocking campaign is analyzing your results and retargeting voters. So your outreach needs to be monitored, tested, and then retargeted to ensure that you're making the most of your door knocking efforts. So the data that you have coming back into your system is actually more valuable than the data we told you about that you can start with. So the data you start with is you know how often someone votes, what political party they are, what they presume to care about based on their online behavior. But the data you have coming back is how they've responded to your campaign. It's what they think of your candidate. It's what issues they care about. So you need to use this invaluable data to follow up with them. You need to call them. You should target them online. You should send them direct mail. Because ultimately, people who are contacted 9 times become 7 to 8% more likely to vote in an election. This is enormous. So fewer quality touches are infinitely more valuable than more low quality touches. So just continue thinking about that. And lastly, and I'm so excited to take questions and talk to all of you, when you're analyzing those results and retargeting voters, you want to loop back to step 1 and start prospecting voters again. So most of our campaigns, they start and they knock doors for about a month. They're not super picky about who they're talking to. They're not super careful about their surveys. And then after a month, they can look through their data or we can look through their data with them. And we say, great, this is the type of person who's supporting your campaign right now. And these are the other types of people we think might support your campaign. Then you can get a lot better about spending your time and resources with voters who are likely to ultimately lead you to victory. So a few things to remember: know your win number, whether it's worthwhile to canvas. Start with good data and constantly reassess and retarget that data. Track and monitor your door knockers, both for fraud, but also because you need to reward them. You need to recognize that they're your boots on the ground and they're the one who's going to ultimately be responsible for your success. And lastly, make sure that you do multiple touch bases. It doesn't always have to be doors knocked. There's a number of different ways you can follow up with people. But make sure that they know that you know you've had a conversation before. There's nothing more frustrating than having a great conversation with a campaign and then getting mail or getting another door knock about something totally random. You can segment these people based on what they care about, and ultimately it's going to lead you straight to victory. So I tried to keep it under 30 minutes. I hope I did that, and I would love to take questions. Thank you guys all so much for joining.
Yeah, thank you so much for that presentation. A couple quick questions I have. First of all, obviously, cell phones hugely changed the canvassing space. Now that people can just walk around and do everything through an app, is there any other upcoming technology that you see as making an equal impact on canvassing?
Yeah, so we're seeing tablets start to become more common in the canvassing space. And that doesn't sound that different, but we're actually working with a number of organizations who are doing far-reaching voter registration drives. And on a tablet, depending on what state you're in, you can actually have someone sign the voter reg right there, read the whole thing, sign it, and it can automatically be uploaded to the state. Other than tablets, which have gotten very common, you're really all set with a basic iPhone or a basic Android to do what you need to do.
Yeah, I'm sure it's hard to anticipate, what we don't already have, right?
Yeah.
Um, so I found 10% of door knockers being fraudulent. That seems like a huge number. A space that's all about civic participation. We'd hope better of ourselves, but what are the quickest mechanisms for identifying that? Like, obviously, are there any automated ways to identify fraud and kind of catch it, as soon as it's happening? Or is that something that you just have to actively look into and just make sure that you're being diligent in monitoring for that?
Yeah, absolutely. So we at Polis, we monitor for fraud in 3 public ways. So we track GPS location. So if you're more than, I think we're seeing 0.01 miles away, or maybe it's 0.1 miles away, then that's very suspicious. If you're knocking a lot of doors per hour and you're not in an apartment complex, that's suspicious. And then lastly, if you're getting a huge number of supporters in a way that doesn't really make sense or doesn't vibe with what other people in your organization are doing. So we'll turn off accounts or we'll contact managers and say, hey, these are some suspicious signs we've noticed. But we also trust that campaign managers know their own canvassers better than we do. And we want to give them the autonomy to decide what they're comfortable with. And then we're actually doing a lot of data monitoring on the back end as well. Once we're told someone was being fraudulent, trying to figure out what other mechanisms we can use from an artificial intelligence perspective, such that our system can put in more flags. Because fraud is a huge problem in this space, unfortunately, even when you're not paying canvassers. And bad data can lead you down some pretty nasty rabbit holes. We prefer not to.
Yeah, I'm sure of it. So then, obviously, one of the easiest things to look for when you're trying to determine where to door knock is political preferences.
Mm-hmm.
But are there any cases that you found, any unique cases where people have reached out a lot across the aisle when door knocking? Maybe there's an issue that might resonate with people of the other party. How do you find that data to find what might resonate with people who aren't necessarily in your political party, and then go out there and work towards that?
Absolutely. So one of my favorite issues right now, just from a following perspective, is energy choice. And so I don't know if everyone on this call has been following this, but Nevada last year had a ballot initiative where they said to people, do you want to be able to choose your energy provider? And so the alternative is states where there's still a utility and you get a bill every month and you pay it. And what Nevada found, and the groups that funded this initiative found, was this was a completely nonpartisan or bipartisan issue. Republicans loved it from the standpoint of economic liberty and choice, and Democrats have traditionally actually supported it at much higher rates. Blue states have more energy choice. And so this group knocked a phenomenal number of doors, and they ended up winning the ballot initiative by about 86%. It was unbelievable numbers. And so, yeah, I think a lot of our ballot initiatives right now, we're not seeing it as partisan issues. And sometimes people do get a little bit too hung up on it. Unfortunately, in terms of electing candidates, most people are still not splitting their ballot. So if you have a limited number of resources, you should stay within your own party or independents who swing towards your party. But as I mentioned, we have thousands of other data points where you can at least change your messaging up to be more relevant to whoever you're talking to.
Yeah, absolutely. So in terms of actually getting canvassers, especially for a small campaign, that may not have a lot of money to energize itself, what are some of the best ways to get people interested in your campaign, get them to want to go out and door knock for you, especially if you're looking for a volunteer team? How do you get people energized to go out there and do that?
Yeah, this is probably the most fun part of a field director's job, right at the beginning. So we talked a lot about making a plan. So your first 48 hours, you need to know what your win number is and how many doors that means. So let's say you need to knock 40,000 doors. in order to win. And you know that most people, when they go out door knocking, knock about 40 doors. So they go out for 2 hours, they're volunteers. So at that point, you say to yourself, great, I need 1,000 days from people. And I think each person's going to give me, who I recruit is going to give me 10 days. So you need 100 people. And so when you have that number, suddenly it feels very accessible to people of how they're going to help you attain victory. And ultimately, the vast majority of people want to be on the winning team. So you have that number. I personally start by going to college campuses, getting in touch with the local political groups, both on the college campus side and the post-college or non-college side, and getting people excited about being part of the team. And then what you do is you hold a huge day of action. This should be the beginning where you train people, because the biggest problem with door knockers is they lack confidence. They get very nervous. And so when they feel like they're on this huge team, you've trained them. If you can afford anything, like stickers, t-shirts, anything where they feel like it's a team, and then you keep them engaged by making it a competition. So it doesn't have to be expensive. They could win, again, like a sticker or a medal or something, especially if they're college students. You can give them course credit. And I've seen teams of volunteers do absolutely remarkable things because they love the organization and they feel committed and well led from the beginning.
Yeah, I did canvassing once when I was much younger, and it's intimidating. It's definitely something that requires a lot of, moxie to get involved with, and to be able to just go out there and knock on doors and try to convince people that you have the right candidate. I
think a lot of canvassers, they just feel lost, right? Because if you're at a phone bank, there's someone standing behind you saying like, yeah, you're doing great. Keep up the good work. But if you're knocking doors, at some point you feel a little bit alone. And so what we always encourage organizations to do, what we think technology enables you to do, is to give your canvassers better support systems. So you should always be reaching out saying like, you did a great job. I was monitoring you. Here's a reward. Here's a prize. And bring them back to the office sometimes and give them that party that they want. Make them feel like part of the team.
Awesome. And one question that we have from someone who's watching right now, you mentioned 9 touches to get someone to be more likely to vote for your candidate. Mm-hmm. Do we have the citation on that?
Yeah, that was Harvard. And we can send that out with the deck afterwards. That was a Harvard political science study that was then replicated by the Washington Post, I believe. It's fascinating. 9 touches sounds really intimidating. I would not knock on someone's door 9 times. I think that's probably overkill. But that's 9 touches of anything. So seeing an ad, getting a phone call, having their door knocked on, anything like that, and suddenly that person says, wow, I recognize that name. I want to go out and vote.
Okay. And we'll go ahead and we'll throw that link in the comments of the webinar after we end the live broadcast. So anyone who wants to see it can check it out. And I think the last question that I have is, what is the biggest weakness that you see on campaigns where maybe they're not utilizing the technology properly to be successful? Maybe it's just, they're having trouble getting themselves energized and motivated to go ahead and do that. What's the biggest roadblock to success for campaigns that you see?
That is such a good question. So when I think of campaigns, I think everything really plays into each other. So right now it's Q4 before congressional season really starts. So what we're seeing is that people are fundraising like crazy, but not necessarily starting other forms of outreach. And it's completely understandable. Everyone has limited time. But ultimately what we need to see is that you have these different pieces working together, because when you're out there door knocking, people feel like you're winning. And when you're sending mailers or you're fundraising, that all feeds into the same general feeling of success, and both for your own volunteers and for the voters. And so I actually think the biggest problem is that people don't stop at the beginning and think about their strategy to win and then stick to that plan. And whether it means you need to fundraise a bit more, you need to recruit a bit more. If you have a really strong plan at the beginning, people will believe in you. And I know especially in some of my earlier campaigns, I was a little bit too excited about executing. And I thought I needed to raise all this money or I needed to knock all these doors. But I really needed to take a step back and think, how many people do I need on my team to do that? How many resources? What does my platform look like before I start door knocking such that I can have the right conversations? So I think it's a general lack of planning, maybe a little bit of lack of asking people who have done it a million times before. But most of the campaigns we work with are great and work really hard and have been wildly successful. So overall, I am very impressed with the campaigns in the space.
I think that circles back to almost any type of marketing that people are doing. Just set goals and stick to them. You know, it's not always so easy because roadblocks always happen. But sticking to those metrics that you set and really putting the effort in to hit those and having accountability is huge for success.
Yeah, absolutely. And not and being honest with yourself also.
Yeah, absolutely.
With any marketing, like I think that's a very good metaphor. Is you have to understand when you have fallen a little bit behind and you need a little bit of extra help. And as I mentioned at the doors, everyone's going to tell you they support your candidate. And that's great. And they probably will. And they probably will go out and vote for you. But you need to be honest and you need to be following up with those people.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much for joining us today. Again, that's Kendall Tucker. She is from Polis. That's polisapp.com. Go ahead and check it out if you are looking for some new canvassing technology. Do you have anything else to add before we go ahead and sign off?
I think the last slide had my email address. Feel free to reach out. We're always happy to chat about questions or helping out your campaign. Do not need to buy our software. We like being involved in the community. Thank you so much to the Lincoln Network. We're so impressed with the work you do. And to everyone who tuned in on Election Day, we really appreciate you and look forward to being in touch in the future.
Yep. And similarly, if there's any aspect of campaign technology or organizational tech that you're interested in improving, feel free to check out deployed.joinlincoln.org. That's our program where we work with you in consulting to improve your tech stack and make sure that you can be successful out there. So thank you all for joining and for watching.
Bye.
Okay.